Humans are 10 times more likely to run over cats than Waymo. So if you're a cat lover, you should be supporting autonomous vehicles, I think is the gist.
Well, it's funny that it programs cats in, but not bicycle riders. Welcome to the Transport Leaders Podcast. G'day, I'm McCabe. I'm founder of Step Advisory, transport planning and traffic engineering firm, and I've worked in consultancy and government for over 25 years across Australasia and Asia.
And hello, I'm Russell King. I'm a transport strategist and the founder of the Transport Leader blog and newsletter, and I've worked on the policy side of transport for around 20 years.
Okay, Russell, what are we going to talk about today?
All right, today, Graham, we have the first part of a two-part special on road safety. So today we're going to talk about the history of road safety. It will be two parts. I'm pretty confident it'll be two parts. I think there's a lot to cover on road safety. And I think you've got to get some of the context right and the history on this, because I think there's a lot of stuff there that informs how we think about road safety moving forward. But let's see how we go. I might be wrong, and we might finish the history of road safety in 10 minutes, and then we'll move on to the thing. But we'll see how we go. And then we'll have to edit backwards, but we'll see. See, the cat is interested in road safety. Cats are a victim of our road transport system. Waymos run over cats. Humans run over cats. I think I saw a statistic actually that said that that humans are 10 times more likely to run over cats than Waymo, based on current data.
The 10 times more what?
Humans are 10 times more likely to run over cats than Waymo. So if you're a cat lover, you should be supporting autonomous vehicles, I think is the gist.
Well, it's funny that it programs cats in, but not bicycle riders.
Right.
Because a Waymo doored somebody in a bicycle lane the other week. And they're not supposed to open the doors if there's a chance of the door hitting somebody.
Yeah, I have to say, I think the pickup drop-off is a real pressure point for autonomous vehicles.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Separate discussion on road safety.
Yes, okay.
That one. That'll be the future of road safety as well. I think we're going to have to cover autonomous vehicles in the future of road safety. So.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yep. Okay. So cat's out of the room. Okay. All right. So okay. Yep. Yes. I think I'll say more than two parts is why I said that.
More than two parts. Oh, that's
yeah. Yes.
Let's see how we go on the. I think you're right. I think it could be three. Let's see how we go. And if we get to the end of episode 2 and it's kind of like we're only halfway through, and I think that's quite a serious possibility.
Yeah.
Let's see what we do.
So streets and roads have always had a problem with people being killed by vehicles, whether they're chariots, cart, bicycles, motor vehicles, buses, trucks, and trolleys. You name it. People have been hit and killed and injured. How did it become an issue, something that we care about?
This is a really interesting question. I mean, reading and listening to some of the history of the motor vehicle, we were clearly concerned about it before the motor vehicle sort of became ubiquitous. So when in the early days of the motor vehicle, okay, when they're driving at like 4 miles an hour, safety was a real serious concern. So there's a great picture of a man standing in front of a motor vehicle, waving a flag, saying "steer clear," right? And that was kind of the road safety solution for the time, right? In terms of motor vehicles, so clearly people were conscious that motor vehicles were going to be a danger right from the start. So it's not as though people went from where I would say that there is a lot of they didn't go from. We were complacent about deaths before. Now motor vehicles, people will die and just shrugged it off. That's not where we were. People were conscious of.
Did they have the same concern about horses?
Of safety.
Yeah, but sorry, you dropped out for a second there. Did they have the same concern about horses killing pedestrians?
It's a great question. I don't actually know. I've heard anecdotal stuff around, horses bolting a piece and injuring or killing people. But whether that was a population-wide concern or whether it was kind of just apathetically shrugged off as that's just the way things are, I haven't seen anything to suggest.
So it's really interesting because there was a lot of concern about bicycles when they were first introduced. They were seen as unsafe and a menace to society, kind of a bit like e-scooters and fat tired e-bikes are at the moment.
what you're saying is in about 150 years, maturity of our debate on bicycles has barely shifted.
Well, they did become ubiquitous in the early.
We've gone better and then worse, is what you're saying.
Well, yeah. So we've gone from a really poor level of understanding and integration to one with them being everywhere, because they were often the fastest and best mode of transport to get around. So if you wanted to get to a railway station or a tram line, then your best way of doing it was by bicycle, because cars were too expensive. So it's when cars became cheap enough that they were affordable, and I'm using affordable, the quotes kind of thing. They were still, relatively, very large investment for a family. Yeah, my grandfather, for example, didn't have a car until the 1940s. It wasn't until much later. So the bicycle, but then as you get more and more cars, then it becomes less and less safe for people to ride bicycles.
Yes, or just simply cross the road.
Well, yeah, well, and there's a priority thing, and there's who gets the right of way, and in America the cars won. Not so much in Australia, and even less than I would say in the UK, until you get till the 1960s in the UK.
Yeah. So before the motor car, there is some concerns about safety.
Yeah, there's
Okay,
always stories of people being run over by stagecoaches, or horses getting run.
Yeah. I mean,
Right.
the encouraging thing I find is that my impression is that those things would make headlines, whereas I'm not sure that a large number of our tragic deaths on our roads make headlines these days. It's almost, it's become so, there used to be a thing in the media, which was if it bleeds, it leads, except maybe on road accidents. Unless you have a lot of bleeding, then maybe it gets there, or it's a particularly, it's a child and it's a particular tragedy. But my impression is that most things get at best a kind of passing. A few people died on the roads this weekend, kind of thing.
So, no, mostly it is reported now, because the number of this entire conversation is going to exclude the developing world and the United States of America, because the rest of the world, the developed world, aside from the US, has done a pretty good job on reducing the rates of fatality. So fatal crashes are more likely to be reported because there are actually fewer of them than there used to be.
So I am going to defend our United States cousins before stabbing them in the back. And what I'm going to say is that the US, in terms of reducing its roadkill, was tracking pretty well for alongside other developed countries for a long time, from about the 1970s, I think, through to the early noughties. And then progress in the rest of the world seems to have continued, and it seems to have stalled in the US. Isn't that fair? It's not like the US has been behind all the time and has been making very little progress in all that time. That's not fair.
So there's a couple of step changes that either haven't happened in the US or have been state dependent. So one is mandatory seatbelt wearing.
So let's pick up on this, the history, right? So where do these things called seatbelts come from?
Well, so they're actually invented by the car industry. So and I'm probably going to get this wrong. So there's a lot of improvements in cars actually come out of the insurance industry, particularly in the America. So the automotive insurance industry has very important role in improving vehicle safety, because they've always been trying to find ways to reduce that. So the Insurance Institute of Highway Safety in the US, they're the ones who really drove crash testing and crashworthiness and star ratings on motor vehicles. So they and government agencies around identify the things that keep the occupants safe. So one of the big things the seatbelt does is it stops you being thrown out of the vehicle if the vehicle rolls. So it also stops you from hitting your head against the dashboard, which is the windscreen, which are three big causes of fatal injuries, solved through one simple piece of fabric. So, which, was originally across the waist, and when you had a crash, you would still project forward and you'd still hit your head, which is how we ended up with the lap sash.
Yeah, the 3-point seatbelt, which was invented by an engineer at Volvo, I believe.
Yeah.
And they could have patented it, I think, and deliberately chose not to, in order for they could see how much safer it was and decided that they would therefore allow everybody to use it.
What? Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So it made a difference, but then in this case, it wasn't the invention of the seatbelt alone that was sufficient. It wasn't, because there were human behavioral challenges as well.
Yes. Yeah. So, and there are still people who, for some conspiratorial reason, think that a seatbelt does more harm than good. Improve citizens of the world. I would call those.
One of humanity's strengths is its diversity, but one of the drawbacks of that diversity of thinking is that there is always, no matter how good the evidence is on something, there'll always be a few people who dissent. So
you sound like a politician there.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, Graham. I'm greatly thankful for that compliment.
So when seatbelts become mandatory, you have about a 20% reduction in serious and fatal crashes. So that's a really big drop in the 1970s. So take that up.
Yeah. Now, that mandatory use of seatbelts was very controversial at the time, wasn't it?
Yes.
This was not like the entire population of the country was like, you should be wearing a seatbelt. This is a no-brainer. Go and do it. And therefore, the mandatory piece was there. This was a very controversial piece and required a lot of effort politically in order to make it seatbelts mandatory, didn't it?
Yeah. And then the next which was a progression, is the introduction of drink driving. So consuming alcohol and then driving. And again, one of the standout things about the United States is their constitutional rights about illegal searches. Is there has to be a reasonable suspicion that you've been drinking in order for them to test the alcohol content of your breath, or do can you balance and walk down the side of the road, kind of non-scientific approach to things. Whereas the rest of the world introduced breath and blood testing or breath testing on the side of the road and reduced the limit. So depending on where you are in the world, you might have some jurisdictions which are still a 0.1% by weight of alcohol, and others which are 0.2, which is basically just covering off you having a medicine or eating a cake or something that's got some alcohol. So the introduction of strict alcohol laws and testing then also drove down the fatal and serious crash rates significantly as well.
So going back to when I was an undergraduate, and my original undergraduate degree was biochemistry. And one of the courses I had to do in my first year was physiology. And one of the experiments we had to do was an alcohol consumption versus reaction rate test. Yep. So we were put into pairs. One of us had to drink alcohol. So this is a bunch of 18-year-olds 30 years ago. Whilst the other one had to measure, and then we had to sort of do a test of how good your reactions were off the back of that using, if I remember correctly, I think it was a ruler dropping, and it was how quickly you could stop the ruler. And so you could sort of see how your alcohol consumption increased, your rate of reaction quite precipitously and very quickly, very noticeably. With very small amounts of alcohol, it made a significant difference. But again, on the alcohol testing, this was not like a home run, was it? I mean, this was like the scientific evidence, the research evidence on both the impacts of alcohol, the effects of alcohol, the impacts it was having on your driving capabilities and the accident rates, etc. The evidence was overwhelming, but this was not like the population was, please bring in random breath testing. This will make us all safer.
Yeah, And there's a great ABC Australia story that I'll put a link to in the show notes. So in the
It's
19th,
the Australian ABC, just to clarify.
yeah, Australia.
Sorry.
So in the 1960s, kind of like some places in the USA, you had to be suspected of drink driving in order to be tested. So they did have testing machines, but one of the interesting things was in the story was that there were no convictions for people with a blood alcohol concentration below 0.12 in the 1960s, despite the legal limit being 0.05, which is still the legal limit in all of Australia. So in the 1980s, they introduced roadside or random breath testing, which is you pull over a random sample of the cars that are travelling past and you give them a mandatory breath test. And it's an offence to refuse the test. So if you refuse the test, you are presumed to be guilty. That's the way the law works. And very similar in other parts of the world except the United States.
Yeah.
So
And
the United States, you can't just pull somebody over and give them a breath test.
Yeah. Now in Australia, these random breath tests are called RBT, well known and ubiquitous across the country. And during especially long weekends where there's a public holiday at the end or around public holiday times, the police have RBT checkpoints all over the place, don't they?
And that's generally paid from road safety funding.
Yes. So one of the things in Australia is that fines around road safety. So if you speed and you get fined, those fines by law, certainly I think in New South Wales, I'm not sure about every state, but in a lot of the states, is that money then has to go back into improving road safety.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that strikes me is that we've had two examples there where the scientific evidence, the research base was overwhelming in favor of these safety pieces. And in hindsight, we can also see the benefits of putting that legislation in. It's not as though there's a huge number of people now who are saying unwind, alcohol restrictions on driving or removing of the mandatory seatbelt rules. The people who are advocating for that are considered cranks, right? It's a very minority sport. I don't think I know of any mainstream politicians who are advocating for those things, even the libertarian party, right? So I think, although we're not going to be talking about the future of road safety, I think one of the things when we're thinking about various measures for road safety is for politicians, they are going to have resistance to even the best policies for improving road safety. I think you have to accept that that's going to be the case. We seem to have very great difficulty as a species in dealing with these sorts of changes and maybe it's different on, seatbelts and alcohol. I'm sure there are nuances there about why people wanted to prevent them, but it has been, it's a significant challenge for our road safety moving forward. That even on things like that, where it's the minimum change around behaviour, certainly in the case of a seatbelt, right? Yeah. And even then, there was very significant resistance.
Yeah, and when you look at the next big change, which is speeds, so setting lower speed limit, the change from a default speed limit, urban speed limit from 60 kilometres an hour to 50 kilometres an hour, which is now seen as very unprogressive in a lot of the developed world. A lot of places in Europe are now looking at 30 kilometres an hour as a blanket, and people who use imperial units, you can do the conversion yourself.
20's plenty is the campaign in the UK. 20's plenty because they're talking about mile per hour. The UK is a strange hybrid between having imperial measures and metric measures, depending on what it is you're measuring. So milk is in imperial pints still, as is alcohol. Pints of beer, okay, but distances tend to be miles and speed tend to be miles, but lots of things are also measured in the metric way.
So that took local councils to bully their state governments into letting them trial it on certain roads. And
This is the reduction to 30
from
kilometers.
50 to 50.
Oh, from 60 to 50. Okay.
And then it started becoming more and more widespread. So you had this issue of councils having to pay for all these signs and pavement markings in order to reduce the speed limit on their local street, and having to do applications to do this on a street by street basis. And eventually state governments got overwhelmed and just went, well, we'll just do it everywhere. If you drive around our capital cities, you'll see all these 50 signs and pavement markings, safety basis. So, the your likelihood of being killed by a motor vehicle, if you're on a bike or walking, is basically zero at 30 kilometres an hour.
Yeah.
So we have a political issue of it's going to cost people time.
Let's keep the focus through on the history.
The history is repeating itself, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. So what was the argument for not going from 60 to 50? Was it time?
It was time. It was impacts on having to change all the sign. A lot of, I suppose, spurious issues. It'll take me longer to get places. Well, in an urban area, it doesn't take you longer to get places. And, most modern cars now have they tell you what your average speed is. And if you drive even primarily on arterial roads and motorways, your average speed is going to be in the 30 to 40 kilometres per hour. So reducing small sections, increasing your time in small sections isn't going to change that.
Yeah, I saw some research recently, I think, which was looking at the impact of going to 30 kilometers an hour in an area. I think it might have been in Italy, maybe Bologna, but I don't know. I can't remember where it was, but it was like literally the time impact was less than a minute. It was seconds on journey times. It was ridiculously small with big impacts and savings on lives. I think but it does highlight again, doesn't it, that there's not many, I don't know of very many people who are currently campaigning to go from 50 to 60 in Australia. I'm not seeing that campaign running. So it's not as though, so again, what we're seeing is that inbuilt bias into the status quo. You set a number and then there is a big challenge of making the case for changing that number.
So we have had some counterfactual speed increases. So the motorways in Sydney, the new motorway tunnels, were set at 80 kilometres an hour with a design speed of 90 kilometres an hour.
Yep.
So generally you design above the speed at which you want to set the speed limit because you want to have a forgiving road environment. But one of the campaign promises from the incoming government in New South Wales was to increase the speed limit from 80 to 90 kilometres per hour. So, which has a whole heap of negative traffic operational impacts because it actually creates more friction and more shockwaves and things like that for another time when we talk about traffic flow. And also some of the rural highways. So the Northern Territory used to have a no speed limit outside its urban areas, and that was initially reduced to 100. It was on the Stewart's Highway was increased to 130, and the Newell Highway, which runs inland between between Melbourne and Brisbane, it had its speed limit dropped from 110 to 100 kilometres an hour, and was then re-raised on the time issue, which for a truck traveling 1,000 kilometres, 10 kilometres an hour average speed does actually have a time impact. But that was and that's it should have been a non-issue in that the supply chain should have actually just dealt with that.
Yeah.
Rather than the industry having to fight to increase the speed again because of their time pressures.
Okay. So what we've got so far in three things that have made significant improvements to road safety. We have a technology in the car combined with a human behavioral change, i.e. to use the technology, not just to have it in the car, seatbelts. We've then got a behavioral change, which has been encouraged significantly by enforcement by the police, right? Random breath tests.
Supported by technology.
Supported by technology of the random breath test itself, yeah. And thirdly, then we have the changing of the speed limits, okay, presumably with a limited amount of enforcement.
Yeah, enforcement of speed limits is very much around risk behaviour. So the other things that support all of these is analysis. So having professionals doing analysis of crash histories, black spots, where behavioural issues are occurring. Random breath testing isn't really random. It can be random in that in Australia, at least vehicle can pull you over and give you a random breath test. But the roadside breath testing is generally around locations where there's been a historical issue with drink driving.
Right. So it's not random in terms of location, but it is random in terms of individuals, isn't it? Or the locate, because in terms of if you're driving down that location, there isn't like any discretion in terms of who gets breath test and who doesn't. So it doesn't get
depending on where you are, you may actually have them pulling every vehicle over.
yes. Okay. So in that sense, I suppose that's the kind of I think the aspect of what it means by random.
Yeah.
Generally.
Yeah.
So hold on.
So, and then you've got road technology, which is also improved. So safety barriers to stop vehicles, going off into a gully or having head-on collisions.
So let's stop. Because I think what we're touching on here is, and you touched on it earlier, which was black spots. So talk to us about the concept of black spots and the process for dealing with black spots and why that's been extremely useful in terms of improving road safety.
Yeah. So black spots, unfortunately, are a trailing indicator. So you have to have had the crash that's resulted in now deaths or serious injuries, so involving hospitalisation. Previously,
So what is a black spot? A black spot is where there is an above average accident rate or something like that?
The definition varies. So it can be based on crashes per million vehicle kilometres. It can be based on just pure number of injuries. 3 injuries in a 3-year period at a location or on a stretch of road. It gives you an indication that there's an issue. So a lot of the countermeasure approach is we have this location, we know this type of crash is occurring, identify measures to address that type of crash at this location. And so, governments have dedicated programs to address locations like that. And obviously, if one crash on a road that has 10,000 cars a day versus one crash on a road that has 100,000 cars a day, there's a 10 times differential in your crash rate. So you target the ones with the higher crash rate. So that's a pure historical framework, and now it's more a risk-based framework. So it's a combination of that plus what is the road infrastructure contributing to the risk of.
So was the black spot not looking at the road infrastructure?
Yeah. So the risk-based approach is a proactive approach. So it's go out and look at everywhere.
Okay. So it's assessing the quality of the infrastructure per se, rather than waiting for the black spot to occur and then assessing the infrastructure. Is that basically the idea? Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of the work in crash reduction was addressing specific black spots, but now it's moving towards approach of trying to get ahead of the issues to retrofit roads which don't meet current safety standards with measures that do meet current safety standards. So having a forgiving road environment. So if you make a mistake, you're not going to run into anything solid or another vehicle. And ideally, you have time to recover to prevent you having the crash in the first place.
Can we talk about the forgiving road standard? Because I know this is controversial within engineering circles.
Yeah.
Right? So there is a school of thought which is the people are going to make mistakes, therefore we need to build in a forgiving environment. Okay. And therefore, when they make the mistake, it's less bad than it would otherwise have been. There's also an alternative school of thought, which is when you create a forgiving environment, people's speed increases. And so it more than counters the risk of an accident. And actually, so therefore you make it worse. And actually, what you should be doing is engineering the road to slow people's speeds, because we know that the road conditions significantly impact, often subconsciously, the speed that people travel at down that road. So,
So the wider the lane you're traveling in is, the more likely you are to exceed the nominated speed limit.
yeah. And there's other things as well, isn't there? There's things like trees on the side and,
What-
that will impact
what you-
on
what you
peripheral
can
vision
see, yeah.
and impact on the impression that you get on the speed that's appropriate to drive on the road. It all has a significant impact on the speed that then people go and drive. So presumably, are they looking at those things when they're looking at that risk-based thing? Are they looking at let's create a forgiving environment, or are they looking at let's create an environment that slows people down? Which is it?
So
Was it both?
when you're reviewing a section of road, they are both options. So you say, can we widen the shoulder? Can we make the distance to fixed objects such as trees further? So, that's where they start chopping down trees on the side of the road. Or can you put up a safety barrier? So that's for this speed that we want to achieve, how do we make this road more forgiving versus do we want the road to be more forgiving by having a lower speed limit? So, an urban arterial. So, to go back to the 90s, an urban arterial where you have lots of pedestrian crashes in a town centre or a high street. The 1980s approach would be, we fence off the road, stop the pedestrians stepping into traffic, and we cover them all
visiting shops. We don't want people visiting shops. That's the last thing we need.
Well, yeah. So that's the 1980s approach. You engineer out the issue.
Yes.
By corralling the people. So
yeah. We'll get on to jaywalking in a minute, because I think that's an important aspect of this as well.
So that's the infrastructure solution.
Okay.
So the speed solution would be, this is a high street, therefore we lower the risk of a vehicle actually hitting a person, and we, do other countermeasures so that people can actually cross the road safely. And then the planning solution is you go, we shouldn't be having lots of cars coming through this high street in the first place.
Yes.
And that they are all political decisions.
They are political decisions, but politicians are supposed to make decisions based on advice. And I think one of the problems that we are having in the transport space is that the advice is not consistent, and that there are different views within the same agency on what is the right advice. Okay. Which often means that the ministers don't get any advice because they can't agree on what the advice should be. And so you then don't get good quality advice. I mean,
a lot of these decisions probably, I know they don't make it to ministerial. The planning,
right? So when you say it's a political one,
it's a bureaucratic political decision.
There's a default position that already exists when a new minister comes in. Now, a minister isn't said, here's our default position. Are you happy with that, minister? That very, very, very rarely happens. In the vast majority of cases, we'll just keep quiet about what our default position is. And if the minister wants to change it, or the new mayor wants to change it, that's up to them. But we'll have that discussion as and when it gets raised, as opposed to proactively raising it. Part of the reason...
It's not so much keeping quiet, it's just business as usual until somebody says, why are you doing that?
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think there's also, there's a kind of question for me about the quality of advice that you're providing to a minister. So if your road safety section says slower speeds are the way to go, right? And that's our strong position within an agency, okay? There'll be lots of naysayers within the agency at the moment.
And outside the agency.
Yeah, but the important thing is the agency is providing advice, and it can say there'll be stakeholders that support this and there'll be stakeholders that are against it. And that's a political lens, right? But within an agent, but the problem, one of the challenges here is within an agency, you have divided opinions. And when the opinions are divided like that, it's the status quo that predominates. So that's one of the challenges in terms of creating a safer system is the viewpoint of transport professionals is not, when there's divided views, right?
Yeah, and you only have to look at the recent debate around the national default speed limit. So
let's not get on to current present stuff. Let's stay on the historical stuff, right? Because it's still.
well, but okay. So okay, back
So
in
we've got 4 things that have made a significant difference so far to safety, right? So seatbelts, alcohol, removing alcohol, um, the speed, reducing the speed limits, and tackling black spots. Is there anything else that's made a significant impact that we're missing?
so heavy vehicle driver regulation.
Yes, really good point. Okay, heavy vehicles. Yes.
Yeah. So historically, truck driving was a bit of a cowboy industry. It was about how fast you could move your payload, and get it to the destination, pick up the next load.
So when you say cowboy, you mean largely unregulated. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, well, and even large trucking companies who had a duty of care to their staff, sometimes would not dissuade their staff from taking shortcuts.
Yeah. So let's be frank about it. In the trucking industry, time equals money. Okay, because it increases your costs. And therefore, the incentives to maximize the amount of driving time is heavily incentivized. And one of the things that therefore can become compromised is safety.
So truck driver fatigue and speed-related crashes, they were the 2 things that were very heavily targeted. So reducing the maximum speed of trucks to 100 kilometers an hour, rather than the default speed limit of 110, and introducing mandatory rest periods.
Yeah.
And the rules for rest breaks in Australia and Europe are quite complex. Basically, you have to take a break every 4 hours, and the longer your shift, the longer your total amount of break has to be. And that's had a very significant impact on trucks and buses being involved in crashes.
Yep.
And so not just crashes with other vehicles, but also just single vehicle crashes. So trucks running off because the drivers are fatigued.
Yeah. So there is a regulatory piece here that's sort of enforced changes in behavior for safety. So that's 5 big buckets on road safety of things we've done historically that have made a significant difference. And this is another big one. Can we talk about jaywalking? Because we've touched on pedestrians and pieces, right? And I think it is an important aspect of this because we need to be thinking, I'm certainly one who advocates thinking multimodal when it comes to road safety. Okay, rather than I think our lens, which has been car-centric thinking on road safety.
Do you want my diatribe on how jaywalking's not actually a thing in the UK or Europe or Australia?
Well, you say it's not a thing, okay?
It doesn't exist.
Well, isn't it
People are allowed to cross the road.
Sorry?
Away from crossings.
Yes, but I think although jaywalking might not exist as an offence, okay, I think it has penetrated as an attitude to the way that we engineer our streets. And that engineering is based on a safety lens, which is why I wanted to pick it up, right? So my understanding, the origins of jaywalking basically was historically before the motor car, streets were for people. And yes, you could have also your carriages, your horse-driven carriages, etc. Okay, but people rubbed along with them for better or worse. Okay, bicycles, etc. And effectively, that was slowing down motor vehicles quite substantially. And so the motor vehicle lobby, which was having problems with both the desire for its car owners to be able to get to places quicker, and also that it had an increasing road safety problem, which was being exposed and people pushing back against it, invented this concept called jaywalking. And it was a derogatory term based around basically somebody who came from, I think, from the, I'm trying to think of the word, but basically somebody who wasn't from the local area and was coming from Hicksville, and basically gets governments to turn it into regulations that you have to keep pedestrians out of the road, which then speeds up motor cars and keeps the friction between cars and pedestrians down, arguing for a road safety aspect. Now, that was an American piece, and they enforced it through the legal system and the police enforcing it, etc. But it does seem to me that a lot of our engineering, you touched on it earlier, is about keeping pedestrians out of the way rather than creating a safe environment for a multimodal system.
Yeah. And the number of people in my profession who do not understand the rules around pedestrians is, well, it's not surprising, but it is disappointing.
Is it a training problem? I.e., is there original traffic engineering training kind of very much focused on the car and not focused on multimodal approach?
But it's not just traffic engineers; it's also transport planners and some police.
Okay.
Even though the police are the ones enforcing it. So not the police who are enforcing the regulations. They actually understand what they're enforcing, but their general attitude of pedestrians should only cross at corners and crossings.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is not the hallmarks of a well-formed street.
Yeah.
So yeah. So while it doesn't exist as a technical concept, it does come through in behavioral attitudes to historically to how people move. And on roads rather than streets, there is still a lot of that attitude within the industry that if the primary function is the movement of vehicles, then people should not be attempting to cross the road.
Yes, which means that you get fewer crossings.
You get fewer crossings, you get longer crossings because the crossings are at intersections where there's usually turn lanes.
Yeah.
So
6 lanes effectively.
well, at 10 in the new greenfields areas. You could be crossing up to 80 meters to get across the road in an area that's affected by heat stress environment in summer. Whereas in the mid-block areas, those roads may narrow down to 50 or 40 or 30 meters, but they don't put the crossings in those locations unless they're an overpass or an underpass.
One of the things I think that's probably worth us talking about is how we've measured the rate of injuries or accidents. I say accidents, rates of collision, crashes, right? Is it, because my understanding is that there's lots of debate about this, whether it should be per kilometer, whether it should be per capita, right? Now, I mean, you touched on earlier about, per 100,000 vehicles versus the 10 per 10,000 vehicles. That's a kind of rate per vehicle traveling down a road. What's your thoughts on the different measures and which one's the right indicator here? Because it is disputed, I understand, and it does make a big difference in terms of decision making.
So if you go into a Vision Zero approach, so 0 fatalities, 0 serious injuries, then the raw number is important because that's what you're dealing with. But then you can go from there. You can go to per head of population, which obviously it makes America with its 40,000 odd annual fatalities look not as bad because it's 40,000 out of 300 odd million.
Close to something like that. Anyway, more than 300 million people.
Just using round numbers, people can do math in their head.
To the nearest 100 million, yes. Okay.
Yeah, rounding down, and then you go to the crash per million vehicle kilometers traveled. But the other thing is the things that you're actually recording. So in Australia, we record towaway crashes. So which are ones where the vehicle's either towed or police have been called to the crash. Then we've got minor injury crashes, so ambulance attended. Then we have serious crashes which result in hospitalization, and I think there's a threshold on the hospitalization duration. And then we have fatal crashes. And within that, there's a lot of unreported crashes which are dealt with purely by the insurance industry. So when you're looking at intersections, most crashes at intersections are rear enders. And then it's only, as the severity level increases, that the types of preeminent crash changes, unless you have a significant issues such as sight distance to the queue, the back of the queue, or vehicles might be approaching too fast in order to be able to stop before they join a queue of stopped vehicles.
So in terms of understanding the progress you're making, obviously on Vision Zero, it's just the raw number. It doesn't tell you, you could end up with, as we're seeing, significant population growth in an area, right? And as a result, significant increases in driving. And so therefore your number of accidents, because your exposure has gone up, your number of accidents could, your number of, crashes could go up, even though the system is now safer.
Yeah. So what could happen under a countermeasure risk assessment black spot approach is that progressively you eliminate all the external features that are involved in crashes. So
External to
the driver.
external to the driver.
If you're having head-on crashes and you put a safety barrier between the opposing directions of traffic, then it doesn't matter how much your traffic goes up, your rate goes down to zero at that location. But the more black spots that you treat, the harder it becomes to address the remaining crashes, which can become behavioral or community related. And I know we're going to talk about this in the next episode. Things like flat-faced trucks and utility vehicles.
Yeah.
The increase in pedestrian fatalities over the last 10 years.
So when I became a councillor, a cabinet member and a councillor, and I had responsibility for, one of the responsibilities I had was for road safety. And, the head of transport came and had a chat with me about road safety. And he's like, we've spent the last 20 years working on black spots. That was their predominant strategy and has been very effective at reducing the number of accidents and had done a great job because we weren't responsible for things like alcohol or seatbelts. They were done obviously at a national level, but at a local level, it was very much focused on black spots. And the problem we then had was we didn't have any more black spots. What we had was, level of accidents that were taking place, but where they took place was effectively random. Right? There was no specific trends. And so we were working to work out what was the next strategy for reducing the accidents when we had that scenario. And I think we'll talk about the future of that, but that was certainly where, this was more than a decade ago now, where we were in London, right? So it's an interesting challenge.
So so the other side to addressing black spots is addressing behavioural issues. So when you when you're doing when you're doing crash analysis, you look at locational factors, but also behavioural factors. So, are people running red lights? Those type of things. Are they crossing to the wrong side of the road in their crash? So you start also looking at the crash types, and the other factors. The key reporting measures, drug and alcohol environment, speed involvement, distraction, and outside of the road environment. So in Australia, we do a lot of local road safety campaigning around drug and alcohol and speed and fatigue, and including things like having liquor records where licensed venues selling alcohol will contribute to things like free buses to get people home, or a taxi service.
Yeah. Okay. So probably the one area I think we haven't covered as well, and it's interesting that we haven't covered it, is on top of seatbelts, there has been a lot of other changes to car over the years in order to try and make them safer for the occupants of the vehicles. There are some ones where, we focus on children, so car seats for children, but there's also things like, roll cages and airbags and things. So have those things only had a marginal impact Is that what we're saying? They have had an impact, but it's been marginal?
It's non-trivial. So they do all have an impact. So child seats significantly reduce the rate of serious injuries in children, because when you have a seatbelt which is sized around the average male, sorry, the average white American male.
Yes. It's a significant important point, because those seatbelts are not designed for women. They are, and they're certainly not designed for kids, but they're not even designed well for women, right? Because all crash test dummies were men.
So children and small adults would do in a crash, would have an activity which is called submarine. They would go slide underneath the seatbelt and be projected forward, which is how dedicated child seats came about. And unfortunately, babies were also often carried in the arms of their mother.
Yeah.
So when there was a crash, mother would lose hold of the baby. And so yes, so they have a very significant impact on safety. So roll cages, crumple zones on vehicles, they all increase survivability. So they've all contributed to the downward.
So let me ask you about the crumple zones. So one of the reason for the crumple zones is it disperses the energy of the crash. So there's less energy effectively affecting the people inside the vehicle. Does it help the pedestrians or people in the other vehicle as well? Or is it very much focused on the people who are inside the vehicles?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Depends on the type of vehicle. So if it's a vehicle that meets European safety standards, then it will protect pedestrians and cyclists as a modern vehicle. If it has an exemption, or like trucks do, and large utilities and SUVs, then probably not. So crash crumple zones protect the occupants of both vehicles, and in Europe and Australia and Japan, not North America. So there is I suppose, a duty of care to community aspect to the crumple zones. But if you have two solid blocks, like two 1970s cars hitting head on, then all that energy has to go somewhere. So if you replace one of those vehicles with a vehicle that has a crumple zone, then part of the energy is dissipated. So even the person in the 1970s car is still better off because they have less energy being transferred into their body.
Okay. Yeah. So we're coming up to the end of our sort of historical look at road safety. So we've made a lot of progress on a whole range of fronts on road safety through a whole range of interventions and different types of interventions. Okay. A lot of those interventions have had resistance from the public, and certainly the in-car ones as well have had resistance from the industry itself, the car industry. Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. I take it back.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you think about it, your own example of Volvo inventing modern seatbelts.
Yeah. But I'm not so sure that when they were made mandatory in the cars, I don't know with respect to seatbelts, whether the industry was in favour of rolling out seatbelts, 3-point seatbelts as quickly as possible or not. I don't know. I haven't seen one thing one way or the other. But
I mean, the history of car improvements is, if they can't sell the car for more if they don't think they can sell the car for more when something is mandated, then, i.e. maintaining or increasing profit margin, then that's when they're more likely to oppose it.
Yeah, which is a natural, are you aligning incentives, right?
Yes.
Right? So it's not a hard understanding of where they're coming from, right? If you can align incentives, then you can get better safety outcomes. And we'll talk about where incentives are at the moment and the problems that's causing for the future piece. Is there anything else we're missing in terms of, we've made significant progress, but now the challenge is, how do we go from where we are today to vision zero, or at least significantly reducing from where we are today, especially as some jurisdictions are starting to see a tick up in accidents. Sorry, in crashes.
I'm sure I'll think of something between now and next week.
We can always record it and edit it in, right? If there's something that you were like, Russell, we really need to mention this thing, we'll add it in.
Yeah, just gonna make sure we're the same shirt.
Have an interesting thing, right? Remember which shirt you're wearing so we can edit it in. All right. So then let's round that up then as the history of road safety and the progress that we've made and some of the less interesting lessons that we've had in terms of the challenges of pushing through those road safety measures.
Yeah.
Right. And then next week, we'll start looking at what next? Where do we need to go from here? Oh, great.
I think that's a good way to do it. And I'm sure that people will have identified all the flaws in our arguments, but unfortunately we'll have recorded the next episode before you get to tell them to us, so you can double down on where we're wrong over 2 episodes.
That's fine. If it stretches to 3 episodes, then they'll have time. We can comment on those. We'll see how we go. Yeah. All right. Well, it was really good to talk to you as always, Graham.
Yeah, you too, Russell. Hopefully people found our informed, uninformed conversation interesting.
Hopefully they did. If you did like this episode, please like, subscribe. And if you're feeling generous, subscribe to our Patreon account where you can buy us a bus ticket or a train ticket. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.